Good afternoon and welcome to this Head Talk with me, Ruth Benny from Top Schools. And I've been very excited about this. We asked you, the Facebook viewers, who you would like us to interview on our next Head Talk. And thank you for all your suggestions. And one of your suggestions was our next guest. And without further ado, let me introduce Toby Newton, Head of School at International College, Hong Kong. Do we have Toby?
I'm certainly here.
Hi, Toby. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. The people's choice.
Oh, feels good. What a start.
So we've got, if you have questions for Toby, please do type those in as we talk and I'll try to work them in. But today we're talking about, well, anything goes really, but you, so Toby, you suggested we talk about something, alternative lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll get to that, but just before we do, can I just ask you, for those of us that don't know you, or for those out there that don't know you as well as I do, tell us a little bit about yourself, you know, your background, your career to date, and yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, I've been in secondary education for more years than I choose to remember now, actually, probably about 25 years, I guess, and I've been in leadership positions in schools for about 19 of those, initially in UK and then in Hong Kong. And I've worked in 2 other international schools other than ICHK. Prior to that, something which has sort of gathered a certain amount of interest in the past was I was in the Hong Kong police actually many years ago, and that's the beginning of my love affair with Hong Kong. And I really do love this city, and I can imagine no other place that I'd want to live more actually than Hong Kong. I just think it has the perfect combination of everything that you would want in a really well-functioning international city. And when I was in the police, the reason I joined the police was naively, perhaps, I assumed that was a role in which I could protect and serve, as they like to say. And then I realized, as I think it's pretty evident when you think about the police more generally, that actually there's another agenda. And that's not to say that protect and serve isn't part of what the police aim to do, but there are other things which can sometimes just dilute that as a primary aim. And I also realized that many of the people who I was working with in the police, in terms of the people I was coming up against and was needing to kind of process from a police perspective, were people who had really had pretty bad luck earlier on in life, and hadn't always had the education and the early childhood experiences that we would want for our own children. And the best way for me to do that, rather than have thousands of children myself, which wasn't very practical, what I would do is work with other people's children as a teacher. So I went back to the UK and I trained to teachers, as an English teacher, in fact, and then went on up from there. And I've never honestly sought to be promoted. I just found myself always a part of conversations which were about how do you expand this and how do you make this more impactful and how can it have a greater effect on a wider sort of constituency. And as a consequence of that, I think I just found myself in positions where gradually I was able to take on a bit more responsibility. And I joined ICHK as a deputy, and that's 8 years ago now. And then with the head teacher at that point was Roy White, who was a friend of mine who I'd worked with in Hong Kong, who was a great guy and who set this school up to be a really effective international institution. And then I was really proud to take on the headship 6 years ago. And that's 4 years ago. So I did acting headship for 2 years. And then 4 years ago, I became head in my own right. And yes, we'll talk more about what that means as we go on, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that you are, I mean, the topic today, we called it alternative lessons, and I think it's fair to say, I talk to a lot of principals, and I really do enjoy always talking to you and listening, because I think a lot of what you have to say is not conventional, and it's very interesting. So we'll get into some of that later on. Just really super quickly, Toby, if you don't mind, could you just give us the school, the facts, you know, what is it, where is it, how many?
Absolutely, yes, of course. So International College Hong Kong, ICHK as we tend to abbreviate it to, is as far north as you can possibly go in Hong Kong before you are in mainland China. So we're right on what used to be the sort of the border with HeadTalk in the top right-hand corner of Hong Kong. And we've been in existence now for 10 years. This is our anniversary year, our decade. It's been rather interrupted by Covid-19, so I think we'll probably celebrate the decade next year more than perhaps this. We have at the moment 360 students. We're expanding quite rapidly at the moment. Historically, we've had 3 forms of entry. Last year we had 4 forms, and we're looking forward to 4 forms of entry again next year.
And what's capacity? You have room for all of those students on that one site?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So say a little bit more about the infrastructure of the school. We're actually we're housed in a government building, and we still lease from the government.
Yeah.
And the original school, I think, was intended to school something like 800 children, but that's on sort of local criteria. We would never want to max out at 800. And in fact, we've set ourselves a ceiling of around 500 students. I won't talk about it now because we've only got a limited time, but I'm very influenced by the work of an anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, and there's something called the Dunbar number. And the Dunbar number is 300. And after that, he says, once you've passed 300, it becomes increasingly difficult to have what he would term anthropologically as a community. So after that, you're entering into the realms of bureaucracy, and people know each other, but they don't really know each other. So we feel that 500 is a manageable amount. We can still retain the kind of vibe that we have at the school. We can still have the ambition of genuinely knowing all the students. Not just as little academic cogs in a bigger machine, but really as people. And I'll come back to that, I'm sure, later. And we run the typical kind of curriculum in Hong Kong in some respects. So in year 10 and 11, we have GCSEs, and then we top out with the IB diploma. But all the rest really is, as you say, rather unconventional. And it's the fruit of years and years of planning, and it has evolved. It's organic, and we're really right at the point now where I feel that we've reached a level of maturity, which is really nice timing because it is our decade as a school, and I feel able to have this kind of interview where I can talk at length about what it is that we're doing. And one thing I'd say right up front, Ruth, is that none of this is proprietary, right? We're very happy to share anything we do. So if there's anything that people hear me talking about that they fancy following up on, whether they're parents or they're teaching at other schools or leading other schools, we're very happy to enter into that conversation. We're a not-for-profit school, and that is the principle on which we operate. We're really not here to make money. We're here to try and educate young people. And we think that we've unlocked some hidden secrets, which, as I say, we're really happy to share with others if they're interested.
Okay. Well, before we get into those hidden secrets, so thank you to those of you who are watching live and everyone who's also watching on Catch Up. If you have any questions for Toby, please post them in the comments below and we'll try to get to them. And if you would like to know what those hidden secrets are, then keep on listening. We're going to roughly structure this, Toby, as during school closure for 4 months, January to April, was it this year? What it's like now in the few weeks before we break for summer, and what lessons that you might apply in the future when we resume school next academic year. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about, we've heard a lot from principals about how teaching and learning was happening during the school closure. So how was it for you from your point of view?
Well, I think I'll open up that question to say it's not just principals. I think there's a lot in the media generally. For those people who read educational blogs or journal articles, there seems to be a version of events which is emerging, which is really to say how wonderful the technology was, and in Hong Kong, I can understand it up to a point because there is a comparison with SARS. And so I've actually got a couple of teachers here at ICHK who worked as teachers in Hong Kong during SARS. And one of the things that they will talk about is the disparity between those two occasions. So when school was halted back when SARS was an issue, as against when school wasn't halted, but that it went into a kind of a digital abeyance, and we carried on learning, and we delivered everything digitally, and how that difference looked, and how much more satisfactory this time around was. And I take that. I mean, there's no arguing with it. Clearly, the various different platforms which we came to rely on absolutely allowed us to retain some level of contact and to continue to work with the students in a way that was productive and useful. However, and that's where really I have some issues, because for me, while I recognize that the strengths up to a point of Zoom and of what we're using now, and of FaceTime and Skype and all the rest, nonetheless, the alternative lesson that came out of it to me was just how important it is to be in co-presence with another human being. So, you know, I'm sitting here, or standing here actually, in my office, talking with you, and yet it's a decent semblance of what happens when two human beings have a conversation. Fortunately, you and I have met each other in the past, so we're able to fill out the content of what we're saying with a memory of what it was like to be actually together in a physical space. But there's so much missing. And it's what's missing, I think, is the essence of education, particularly with younger human beings. And I classify all students up to the age of 18 as younger human beings. I think once they get to university, and I've taught at university, they're a very different creature. They're much more formed, they're much more sort of set in their ways, and they have a much clearer idea of what it is that they would like to achieve. And that hopefully is why they're at university. But at school, it seems to me that a big part of what we're trying to do is to provide young people with the opportunity precisely to answer some of those questions. You know, who do I want to be? Who do I want to be with? Who do I imagine myself becoming? What kind of tools are at my disposal? How do I see this playing out over time? And those are the really big existential questions. And I just don't believe they can be done remotely via screens. I think they have to be done in the physical presence of other human beings. Hopefully, ideally, sympathetic, helpful, supportive human beings. And that's really what a school should be doing.
I don't think anyone's disputing that, really, are they? I mean, none of this was ideal. I mean, having the school closed was far from ideal, but I suppose, you know, schools did the best that they could.
I don't know. I mean, I've read quite a few articles recently that more or less argue that school is now antiquated. It's caught out of its time. It's very expensive real estate that we could repurpose all these footprints. I'm using the language that these people tend to use, and we could redesignate it as a shopping mall or as a whatever. And that certainly, at the very least, we could blend more learning, another fashionable phrase, that we could have some digital learning.
Which was around in the 90s. So.
It was. And I think that, again, is quite important to remind ourselves, is that none of this language is new, but the technology is. And I think the way in which actually some pretty well-established ambitions are now being realized and made genuine possibilities by the technology is actually reawakening some older ambitions which weren't possible at the time, but have hung on in people's imaginations. And I don't think they were very good ambitions back then, and I think they're equally poor ambitions now. I really defend a very strong version of school as a place where young people come to meet with other young people, but also with as many supportive, forward-thinking, progressive adults as possible. And one of the things that we do at ICHK is really try not just to employ teachers. I mean, our school is full of other adults. So we have outdoor educators, we have counselors, we have people who visit, who come with particular areas of expertise and interest. I mean, later on, I'll speak more about the notion of apprenticeship, I think. But this is, for me, what schools should be providing, is not just an academic foundation.
Is that not a generally accepted theory?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't. I have something which I'll say. We've got right into the meat of it immediately, which is great. So this is something I've spoken about in the past. I think when you speak to most international or indeed local school leaders, and you say to them, what do you imagine that school is for? They'll very often categorize it into 4 areas, okay? And those 4 areas are, well, we've got to get good academic results, because this is why we're in existence, okay? This is our raison d'etre, particularly in the fee-paying sector. This is why parents invest in us, is so that we can equip their children with the hard currency of qualifications in order to go on to the next step. And that's right, I recognize that. So absolutely, that's one aspect of school, qualifications. A second one, personal growth. I want my child to develop as a human being. They join you in the secondary sector as an 11-year-old, they leave as an 18-year-old. I don't want them to be the same person at 18 as they were at 11, so I expect them to grow. Fine. As a part of that, maybe a third thing, I want them to be socially adept. I want them to be confident. I would like my child to be able to work with others. So that's another thing that schools are encouraged to do. Ensure that their students are social beings. And finally, I'd like my child to know a little bit about how the world works, right? So I assume some of that will be in the curriculum, but I assume also there will be some aspects of how the world works which are not captured in the curriculum. So those are the 4 things I want. I want qualifications, personal growth, social confidence, and I want my child to understand how the world works. Right, and I subscribe to all of that, and I think that most schools would. But I think it's quite a disingenuous answer, because if you think of that as sort of the classic Venn diagram overlapping, the next question for me is, okay, fine, but all those circles aren't going to be exactly the same size, right? So which of those 4 are you putting the most emphasis on? And I think if most schools are honest, they'll say it's the academics. Why? Well, for obvious reasons. That's what we're going to be judged on. There are no mechanisms by which schools are judged other than the academics. Everyone talks about Bhutan, and Bhutan introduced gross national happiness. So instead of having gross national product, which is what all other countries are judged on, Bhutan said, no, we want to be judged on, are our people happy? And I've seen lip service paid to that notion by so many countries now, but it is lip service. What does the news report on? What do the politicians get excited by? It's the economics, right? And it's the same in schools. The hard currency of schools are these academic qualifications. Now, I think, and I've always thought, that was a pretty appalling state of affairs, because I certainly don't feel that I am nothing more than the sum of my academic qualifications. And I also think that in the past, when I've worked with people, one of the last things I need to know about them is what exam results they got. I need to know something far wider about who they are as a human being. And you're nodding because you know I'm right. So yes, everyone would say the same thing. That yeah, you need certain qualifications just to get your foot in the door and to get that initial interview. But after that, the things that people are really interested in is what kind of a person are you? Now, if I could just say this, so my feeling is this: not only has that always been the case, but where people I think are now deluding themselves is that right now, in the last 5 to 10 years, we're moving into a world where actually those things that academics do capture, they're not going to be very important, because what we know is that if you can capture it in that way, there's going to be a machine that can do it. And that warning came to people in blue collar jobs 30 years ago. So those people who were working on factory floors, or those people who were clerical, those people who were doing that kind of employment with the academic background behind them, they found themselves purposeless, frankly, in a world that had no more use for them. Now, I'm telling you, the way that things are going, that's going to be the case for the professional class as well soon. And because of the power of AI, and because of the cheapness of AI, and because of the ease now with which it can be programmed, and the way that programming always builds on precedent, so you don't have to do that core work anymore, it's been done. Those jobs, which that form of education were preparing people for, those jobs aren't going to be there. And there's a phrase I love from a writer called Gert Leonhardt, who's a futurist. And he talks about androrhythms and algorithms. And he says androrhythms, that is the ineffable, subtle, nuanced business of being a human being. And an algorithm is what you can do with a computer that creates a horrible, degraded version of an androrhythm. Now, I'm interested in androrhythms. What I want is to educate young people who go out into the world really equipped to deal with the complexity of other human beings, not with the proxy of another human being as it is represented in a computer program. And that, I think, is something that all schools need to be thinking about very seriously.
I agree, but I'm just really want to get to the nub of this. Is that not what all schools are saying? I mean, we all hear that, we're preparing our children to do jobs that haven't been created yet, and many. Pardon? How are we doing it? Right. Okay. Well, let's get into that.
Right. So, that's the question. How? So how are you doing it? So tell me how that curriculum that was designed 20, 30, 40 years ago, which is essentially untouched. There's been a certain amount of tampering at the edges, but basically, I'm fresh out of those schools, right? I know what curriculum we were offering. How is that preparing young people for a world which is transforming around us at astronomical rates? Now, I'll tell you something. In a former life, when I was in the UK, I was in the assessment and examination side of things myself. So I ended up being a principal examiner for media studies in GCSE media studies. And I know how glacially slow it was to bring about any change in a GCSE. It took years. And you had to convince this wide range of people, most of whom knew nothing about media, knew nothing about learning, knew nothing about the transformation. They were people who were sitting in a job which they'd been qualified for by quite other sets of criteria, and they would hold everything up, and it would take us years to even change a single question or the weighting of a single question against another question. That is the rate at which education moves. It is prehistoric. And the problem is that around us, the world is transforming at, as I say, astronomic speed. So what you have to do is think of a curriculum, or an approach to curriculum, actually, which can cope with that. And that's what we've done. And that is what we call human technologies. Human
technologies, right? So you're using a lot of jargon, and we will try to break that down for people. You used the word co-presence before, and human technologies. So obviously your students are going to the traditional destination. They're going to IGCSEs and then either IB diploma, or in some cases not the full diploma, right, courses. But what is it that you do that's different to get them there?
Okay, so there's two things I'll say is yes and no. So actually what we've introduced now, and this year for the first time, at least one of our students will be graduating not just with the IB diploma, but with something called a mastery transcript. So you're right. I don't know if it's jargon, but it's certainly edu speak, and I'm aware that I'm fully.
What's a mastery transcript?
Right. So let me tell you about the mastery transcript. The mastery transcript is an initiative that started in America by a group of American heads of school of these small, prestigious private schools in America. And they were just very impatient with the fact that in America, it's even worse than here. They are graduating with just two numbers, their GPA and their SAT. And what this set of heads wanted to do was to create a supplementary, at least, if not alternative, qualification, which would somehow represent the all-round wonderfulness of the students they had been working with. And that's how I feel. I mean, I get to know incredible students here at ICHK, and then all they take away with them is a bunch of numbers. Now, what the mastery transcript does is it operates by credits, and you work towards a certain number of credits, and you stitch those into an overall mastery transcript. And what that does is portrays to the admissions officer of a university a much better sense of who you really are. And there are just three things which are kind of, I hate this phrase, but I'm going to use it, baked in to the mastery transcript. And the three things are, one, no standardization. So the member schools, of which we are just one of two in Hong Kong, I think the other one is Harbour School, we do not have to agree with any other schools exactly what our credits look like. They will tend to group around some of the same human qualities because everyone's agreed pretty much what a good human being looks like, but we don't have to standardize. In fact, we shouldn't standardize. That's the first. The second is no grades. So you don't get a mastery transcript, an A, a B, a C. It's just you've got mastery, and you're master in these areas. And of the 50 odd credits we offer, you're not going to be master of more than probably 8 or 9. And the third criteria is that it must be readable to an admissions officer within 2 minutes, because that's how long admissions officers allocate to any individual student, because they're busy people, right? They've got a lot of candidates to get through. Now, when you take those three things and put them in tension with each other, it's really interesting. No standardization, no grades, and yet it must be readable in 2 minutes. So what we've been working on is how do you get that format?
Okay. What's the awarding body for this mastery transcript?
They're called the Mastery Transcript Consortium. So if you go online and if you Google Mastery Transcript, you'll come to the MTC, and this is the first year that they are going to be awarding transcripts. When we joined 2 years ago, the time horizon was something like 10 years. But such is the urgency that the universities are so interested in this, because they recognize that this is going to offer them so much more insight into the real value that someone can bring to their institutions, that we've been kind of hurried along the road to the point where now this year we've asked some of our year 13s to retrofit what they've done at the school to a mastery transcript. And as I say, I mean, we've literally this morning sent off the first one to see whether it kind of meets the specifications and whether we can submit the rest or whether we need to tweak a bit.
Okay, so we've gone off track a little bit. we were looking at alternative lessons from COVID-19, and we don't have all the time in the world.
No.
Well, okay, let's talk about what happens in your school in year 7. It is only a secondary school, so year 7, 8, 9. What are the students doing? What are some of the interesting projects? And that you have. Well, every.
Sure. So I mean, I think, and it works well to have talked about mastery transcript first, because actually what we're aiming towards. So there's a principle in certainly in education. I think it's shared more widely elsewhere, but it's this notion of backwards by design, right? So you design whatever you're doing on the basis of where you want to get to. And clearly we have 2 places we want to get to now. So we want to get to the IB diploma, and we want to get to mastery, the mastery transcript. So to answer your question, what we do in year 7, 8, and 9 is really of our own design. And we've spent the last, well, as I say, I've been here for 8 years. We've been spending the last 8 years really reconfiguring, redesigning, refreshing, binning much of the curriculum, bringing in our own stuff. I genuinely don't have time to talk about all of it, because as you say, I could talk to you all night, Ruth, but I'm sure no one will be watching at the end. So the headlines for me would be human technologies, which I've mentioned. We do something which we call deep learning, which is when we collapse the timetable and students across the years have the chance to elect what opportunity they're going to do on a kind of an immersive basis. We have something called free learning, which is an approach to learning where you initially interface via a computer program, Gibbon, which is our sort of school management system. But very quickly it takes you into real world situations. You're not necessarily working by yourself, you're working with other students. It's just a way in which to initially get into the learning, and then you're taken through a path, but there's choice throughout. We do big history, which is a university degree initially. It then came down into year 12 and 13. We do it in year 7. And we do it in year 7 in the full knowledge that the kids won't understand it, but they will engage with it and they will be stretched by it. And hopefully it will provide enough of the contours of an understanding that what they then do subsequently makes more sense to them. One of my abiding impressions of my own school life and of many students I've worked with since is I had no idea why I was learning what I was learning. It was this little oases in a desert. I had no idea. The teacher would say, oh, we're going to do this today. And okay, whatever. And my feeling was this was a kind of pretty arbitrary. And I had no idea if this was more important than that, or how this articulated with that, or did that link to this. It's very common in schools to discover that you've got the same child who can do equations in maths. They can't do equations in economics. Why not? Because they just don't make the connection between the two subjects. They experience them as silos. So what big history allows us to do is to sketch out why is it that human beings are as they are, and then deliver to the students to a point where we do human technologies. And when they do human technologies, they discover that actually we are highly technologized creatures. We don't use technology just to mean gizmos and gadgets. We mean anything that I learned from my culture. So for example, Ruth, you're very good at nodding at me, okay? So when you nod at me, it demonstrates, I take it as demonstrating that you're interested and you're listening and you're processing, right? Now, if you sat there absolutely mute like a statue, which you could do, not nodding, not smiling, I would stop talking. Because I take your nodding as a sign that I'm making some kind of sense. So one of the things this is a very trivial example, but it's a good example. So one of the things we'll teach our students to do is, if you're in a conversation, nod at the person if you want them to keep talking. Because that's a way to make them feel that they are precisely in co-presence with someone who has an interest in what they're saying. Now, that we would call that a social technology. We also talk about spiritual technologies, for example. I'll give you one which I often say. So I go into a lot of schools, and everyone's doing mindfulness now, right? Mindfulness is very fashionable, and I'm not knocking it. Great. And I go into schools and I say, oh, you're doing mindfulness. Why are you doing that? And they say, well, we're teaching our kids to deal with the stress of school. And my response to that is, well, why don't you make your school less stressful? That's not we do mindfulness. We do mindfulness, but we teach it as a human technology because we believe that it will serve our kids throughout their lives. I practice mindfulness. I find mindfulness very, very helpful, not when I'm feeling stressed, just when I need to replenish, when I need to refresh. And I would like to share that with young people because it might serve them, as I say, for the whole time they're on planet Earth. It's got nothing to do with the stress of the school. Our school tries to be as stress-less as possible. So that's human technologies. 7, 8, and 9 then really is the first step on what we call an epistemic apprenticeship. An apprenticeship in how to think, to know, and to be. And I'll go back to what you were saying earlier, Ruth. Yes, all schools say the same thing. And all websites look the same. And when you do a tour of every school, they show you the same resources and the same facilities. What I would invite parents to do is just scratch that surface. For example, if someone says, oh, growth mindset, there's another one that everyone does now. Okay, yeah. Growth mindset is into the fabric of our school. And now, how? Well, because when we report, we only use growth mindset language. We don't give grades in year 7, 8, and 9 at all. So our year 7, 8, and 9s just don't get grades. Did the parents like that initially? Not much. But we explained. And we said to them, look, we can't take Carol Dweck seriously and then dump the thing that she says is the single most important factor in leading to a growth mindset, which is stop talking about these finite grades. Because the minute you do that, the minute I tell you you're an A, you're an A. Whereas if I say, listen, that was a really nice piece of work, Ruth, and I'll tell you what, I really enjoyed it. If you were to do X, Y, and Z, maybe you can make it even stronger. The psychology of that is so much more supportive of good learning.
We could talk all night. We can't.
I know. I told you.
We can't. I just want to ask. I mean, scratching the surface. Yeah, we visit all. I visit schools all the time, and a lot of it is just yawn. And it's super good advice to say to parents to scratch the surface. And I imagine that parents that make it all the way out to Chartel Cock.
It's not that far.
It's quite far. But you have school buses running all over, so that's okay.
We do all over.
those parents have presumably done a little bit more research, and so what are some of the questions that they ask you to challenge you or your staff on some of this? I'm just interested to know sort of what Gen Pub generally thinks about some of this.
Such a good question. And I'll answer it honestly. Okay. So what I would say, and I say this having just 3-4 days ago run a virtual parents' evening for our new year 7 parents for next year. So current year 6 parents. And these are people who are a mixture of parents who have their children at our partner primaries, which is ICHK Honlok Ewan, Japanese International in Kingston. And they already know a lot about us because myself and other staff go down and work with them and talk with them. So there's that group. But then there's an awful lot of interest from other parents at other schools. And we held a virtual evening with them, as I say, last week. And what I will say is that honestly, the questions have changed in the last 3 or 4 years. And the questions are no longer that kind of slightly adversarial suggestion that you were giving, kind of, explain yourself, Mr. Newton, tell me what you're thinking, justify this. I think our website does a really good job of all that now. So we've been working on our website really hard for about 4 or 5 years. And if you go on the website, it's not just a kind of a classic school website with pictures of smiling, happy children and the atrium. It really is. It tries to give you a variety of reading. So you can take that initial impression, and hopefully that's a good impression. But then there are also lots of FAQs and 10 things you need to know and why we do this. And I run a blog, which is kind of quite heavy duty, to be honest. It's not an easy read. I don't enjoy writing it especially. It's hard work, but it's worth it, because what I'm trying to do, and you'll see there's lots of teacher reflections, and what we're trying to do is communicate to those parents, why is it you should have faith in this? Why should you do this? Why is it that the things that you've heard for the last 20 or 30 years that you probably experienced yourself as a child, why is it they're wrong? And that's a really hard lesson to take on board. Why is it I've been wrong for so long? And it takes a particularly brave kind of person to say, well, okay, I'm open-minded enough that I can at least listen to that lesson, right? And what we're finding is just increasingly word of mouth. I mean, our parents are happy, and the students are happy. And the parents just talk to other parents, and they come to us not in a state of kind of virgin naivety. Oh, what are you doing? They come to us and, well, I've heard this, and this. Can you tell me a little bit more? And I'm really pleased by that, because it means I don't have to have those conversations, which within 5 seconds, I'm thinking, oh, you're not listening. It's not landing. There's actually no point in this. What I find now is that people are asking me questions which are really actually often saying, well, why aren't you doing more of this? Why are you doing GCSEs at all? Why don't you offer something alternative to a qualified education at IB level? And we can answer that now. If you'd asked me this last year, I couldn't have answered. But because the MTC has come forward.
I did ask you this question a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, and I think I was talking about BTEC, right? And saying we'll look into BTEC because, we recognise that we need to serve a wider constituency of students. I mean, the other thing I'll say about the school, and I think this is, again, answering the question you've just asked. Initially, one of the other questions I was asked a lot, well, 2 questions actually, right? Here they are. One was, haven't you got quite a few special needs kids at the school?
Yes.
And I would say, listen, I just don't believe in the concept of special. Everyone has individual needs, and our ethical duty is to serve as many children as we possibly can. And if we are satisfied that a child is learning with us from however low a base, we will do our best to work with it. Now, there's a language component to that, because if a child literally has no understanding of English, it's hard for them to access our curriculum. But after that, we'll work with any child if they're learning. So that's the first thing. And we don't get that question anymore. And in fact, it looks as if we're going to be very soon opening an individual needs dedicated centre, really, which to my mind is a fulfilment of an ambition I've had for a long time at the school, to widen that constituency. The second one people ask is uniform. this is one of the other great sacred cows of schools, is particularly in Hong Kong and UK. Uniform. Do you have a uniform? And I think we do. We treat it as a technology, right? So this is a human technology. I'm wearing it now. This is our material technology that we choose to use, because the children have got to dress somehow, and we think that there are advantages to them wearing something with the school logo. We think that there is something around teamwork. There's something about feeling part of a community. But we don't want them stressing over it, and we don't want to be measuring people's skirts. So what we say is, as long as you're wearing the logo on the top, and there's a wide variety of shirts that you can wear that will suit all body types, and there's a dress one if you want to look smart, and there's different colors. And if you go on a tour to Singapore, you can create your own. And we just wear the logo and be proud of being a part of ICHK. After that, we don't really care what you wear, to be honest. And if you want to wear a particular pair of shorts, as long as they're decent, that's fine, because we want the students to express who they are. That's a vital lesson that they have to get used to. How do I express myself? How do I communicate myself in a way which is acceptable to the community, but which also says something about me? And dress is one way we all do that. So why would schools shut that down? Now, what I hear at schools is, oh, well, it's all about, we don't want the kids, it's not a fashion show. Correct, it's not. But there are other ways to teach them that lesson than getting in their faces and saying, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. So generally what we tend to believe as the school is, look, let's try and widen the parameters within which we give students agency and choice, and let's see if they can be responsible. And we find that 99% are totally responsible and are able then to grow on that basis. 1% aren't. That means we have a chat with them, and usually if we're patient enough, they come around. So everyone's a winner.
What was the question? I think you answered it. We are going to...
The question was, what questions do the parents ask me? Yeah, and those seriously would be the ones, really. Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap this up. Thank you for those who watched and stayed with us. You write a blog. Are you going to stitch those blog articles together and write a book someday?
I won't make any promises. I'm busy, but I would love to, yes. I mean, I think human technologies is worthy of wider distribution. And there is a book right now being written about our school free learning. So that's going to be coming out.
Is there free learning? I was just going to ask you, I started to ask our heads on HeadTalk, if there's one book that you could recommend that we as parents were to read, what would that book be? I should have given you some advance notice.
Wow. Yeah, just one. That's really hard. I mean, I'll tell you it's not necessarily the answer I would give if I had, a slightly wider remit within which I was trying to educate people. But a voice I really believe in education is Sir Ken Robinson.
Yeah.
So I would say that anything by Sir Ken Robinson, you can't go wrong. And I think his knack is that he, perhaps in a way that I'm not always able to do, he is able to articulate things in a way that parents
very
really
accessible. Yeah, I thought you were going to give us an academic tone, but
no, I won't. Exactly, pointless. No point in that. So it's Ken Robinson, fantastic. Yeah. His latest one, which I can't remember what it's called.
Can we get him to Hong Kong? Do you have any connections? We need to get him over.
No, do you? Do you know? I think actually, I know that the ESF were thinking of it at one point. So maybe you need to speak to Jacques at the ESF.
Hi, Jacques, if you're listening.
Yeah, I want to be invited if he comes.
Of course. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Toby. This will be pleasure. To everybody who was watching us live and everyone who's watching this on Catch Up. Thank you very much. I've been Ruth Benny, and this has been Toby Newton from International College, Hong Kong. Thanks, Toby, again, and I'll see you in real life very soon, hopefully. Okay.
I'd love to. Okay. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Bye.
Bye.